Okay, folks, in this lecture, we are going to be looking generally at the classification of race, and we're going to be looking largely at the United States, okay? There is some history about the construction of race. What do racial categories mean, and where do they come from, and what was the initial effort historically in our global community to classify race. Race early on was an effort of understanding why people were different from one another. Why did they look different? And so those questions of Darwin, largely, in a lot of early history about the study of humans, was a question of why do people look different? And therefore, if people look different, then they must be through and through much different from person to person. And so the categorization of groups of people is what race is. Okay, now I think you're going to find it interesting as we look at this in the United States, how we started classifying people and how that's changed over time. And then we're going to have a little bit of commentary throughout about is the classification of race still relevant? Why do we still classify race when we know that individuals from different racial categories might be more similar than individuals from the same race categories? And then, another question about this that we'll get into the next lecture is what is the experience of race? And do categories of race still matter in the sense of inequality? And the answer to that is yes. So the first question I want to ask you before we get into looking at some slides, and this might be interesting for you to jot down in your notes before you proceed in this video. Oh, excuse me. But there's a question. What do you think the breakout of race is in Owensboro? Or if you live outside of Owensboro, think about where you live. What percentage of people would you say are black or consider themselves black, African American? Write that down. What do you think it is? Write it down. Okay. What do you think is the percentage of people who consider themselves to be Hispanic? Write that down. What do you think that percent is? Okay. What do you think the percentage of people where you live consider themselves white? Write that down. Okay. Now, make sure you write it down and then include that in your notes, if you would. I'd be interested to see what you think it is versus what the data tells us. And where does the data come from? The census survey. Yeah, that's one thing we get from the census survey. And an important point to note here is that race, if you've seen the census survey this year, just as census surveys back to 1970, you realize that individuals complete the census survey. So I determine what race that I am. Well, how do you know what race you are? Look at your skin. That's one indicator of race. But what about people that are mixed? I'll give you a personal example here real quick. So my wife is 50% Bolivian. Her father is from the country of Bolivia. That's in South America. He's Hispanic. My wife considers herself Hispanic. Okay. We have 4 children. And our oldest child has long, dark hair and blue eyes. Okay. Our second child has red hair and green eyes and is light complected. And our third child is got brown hair and blue eyes. He's the son of our family. And our last child has red hair as well and light complected and brown eyes. So when you look at them, they don't look Hispanic. As a matter of fact, my wife sometimes expresses her disappointment that her kids don't look Hispanic. But they are 25% Hispanic. At what percent are you Hispanic or not? I mean, is it based on your skin color? I mean, is it how dark you are? Now, of course, these are interesting questions, but, when you think about it, it's what you feel that you are. It has something to do with your heritage. It has something to do from where you come from. But the fact of the matter is, my children are from Owensboro, Kentucky. Okay? What category do we place them in? It's kind of interesting. So from time to time, my wife will fill out information about our kids, and she is quick to note that they are Hispanic. And then I fill it out, and well, I don't know if they're Hispanic or not. One kid speaks a little bit of Spanish. Hey, as a matter of fact, I speak better Spanish than my wife does. My wife is from Owensboro. Her father's from Bolivia. I spent time in Mexico, and I know how to speak Spanish better than she does. And God knows I have better rhythm. Okay, that's a play on stereotypes. Latin people think that they have better rhythm than other people. Of course, I write music, and I have better rhythm. Anyway, that's a whole nother story. So, I like to point to the dry race board, but I've already erased it. But think back to the lecture on race and ethnicity. Is race biology, or is race actually ethnicity? Something I didn't talk about in that lecture is that don't we oftentimes think that race equals ethnicity and ethnicity equals race, that those go hand in hand, and in fact they don't. Ethnicity, cultural characteristics can change. And as a matter of fact, that's what we have in the United States, a melting pot, where cultural characteristics blend and change and morph and, well, but are you still of some racial category? So these are philosophical questions, but certainly they are also rooted in social science and in some degree now biology, because we understand that biological differences are not good indicators of race, because groups of people don't have biological difference. Individuals have biological difference. Yet, race is still a category for groups of people. So much fun, so much fun. So let's answer the question, what is the distribution of race and ethnicity in our society? Well, here you go. This is the most recent data from the Census Bureau. And you can see it's based on population estimates from July of 2019. Of course, the census survey that's going on right now will tell us more about how this has changed. But, frankly, what we're going to see in the census data is not going to be much different than what you see here. So while we only do the census every 10 years, as I've mentioned to you all, the Census Bureau does regular research. So they update this. They don't survey the entire population in the United States every year, but we have sophisticated research methods and statistical measures where we have a really good understanding, even year to year, how different population characteristics change. Okay, so let's point out a few things. By the way, this population number is about 60,000, 50 to 60,000 in Owensboro, city of Owensboro. So what you have here is you have the city of Owensboro, then you have Davis County. Now, remember, the city of Owensboro sits inside of Davis County, okay? And then you have the state of Kentucky and then the United States. You've got population up here, and you've got a variety of characteristics down here. These are race characteristics, okay? So what did you say? What is the percentage of people in Owensboro, Davis County that consider themselves black? I'm willing to bet that you didn't say it was that. Oftentimes in class, I get ranges from 15 to 35%, okay? Now, this is the city of Owensboro. This is the county. So we are less black than the state, okay? And then look at the United States. Now, the next question I asked you is, what about Hispanics? What percent of people consider themselves Hispanic, okay? And so largely that's down here. So notice that this rate of Hispanic is less than the rate of black in Owensboro. It's less than the rate of black in Davis County. It's less than the rate of black in the state of Kentucky. But look at this. Hispanics are the leading minority group in the United States. So what we start to think about is our experience of race at the local level is not the experience of race at the national level. Now, what we're going to see here in a minute, we're going to look at a map. Racial groups, remember birds of a feather flock together? Well, that applies also to race. There are pockets of race across the United States. There are pockets of race across states as well. So, for example, we know that larger cities are more racially diverse than rural populations. Why is that the case? Okay, that's an interesting socio-historical dynamic about why migrants find themselves more likely in cities than elsewhere. Not just people of color, but white people as well. Again, most people in the United States, most people in the world, most people in states live in cities. Okay? So, what else do we want to point out about this? Look at this. White alone in Davis County. We are an extremely white community in Davis County. Look at that compared to the U.S. average. So the experience in Owensboro, Davis County is largely an experience of being white. Okay? And oftentimes people say that Hispanics outnumber blacks in Owensboro, and I think this has got more to do with the increase that we've seen with Hispanics in Owensboro, Davis County over the last 10 to 15 years. But just because we have an increase doesn't mean that there are more people of one category versus another. So if this didn't kind of shake you a little bit of what you think about things, and most times it does, people's perception about race in Owensboro is quite different than what it is actually in terms of the data. Now, we're even going to take this a step further, okay? So let's look at the next slide. We know that right now in the United States, young people, those 17 years of age and younger, most young people 17 years of age and younger, a majority of young people 17 years of age and younger are non-white, okay, in the United States. So what that means is a majority, more than 50% of young people in the United States are black, Hispanic, Asian, or Native American, or Pacific Islander, people of color. The population dynamics at the national level are changing. And we're going to see something in the next 10 to 15 years that we've never seen in this country. A majority of people in the United States, not just young people, a majority of people in the United States are going to be non-white. Now, does that mean in Owensboro? Probably not. Remember, Owensboro, Davis County is 86 to 90% white, the overall population. Now, the overall population in the United States is 76% white. That's the overall population. Keep in mind that being non-white also might mean being what we call mixed, which is an interesting term in and of itself. So if you're mixed, let's say that your parents are both black and white, or let's say your parents are Hispanic and white, what do you consider yourself? Based upon the color of your skin or something else, okay? So now it says by 2044, that's 24 years, these projections have been revised. This came out in about 2016, and the projections, I said 10 to 15 years, so around the year 2035 is where we're expected now to see that change. And you can see what this makes up. This is white folks, so right about here is where the projection was. Well, let's move it up to about right here. And the reason why we see this changing is that we not only have continue to have a larger makeup of the population that are Hispanic and also Asian, this is increasing. The black population is remaining about the same, But these people are also having kids with these people. So whether or not you are whether or not you're white or Hispanic or white or black or something else might be dependent upon your parents. Okay. Lots of interesting dynamics here. So I mentioned that these categories come from the census, and we're going to take a look at this. I think you'll find this a little bit interesting. Let's look at categories of the census dating back to the first census. These are the actual categories of the census from 1790 to 1840. The actual categories. Now, what's kind of interesting, you look at 1790, there's only one category, of color, white. There's no other category of color there. Actually, there's also a category of gender. You see white males and white females. There's also a category of economics and labor. Economics, labor, and work. Are you free or are you a slave? Now, I point that out because racial categories, in some part derive from whether or not you are free to work or not free to work. And part of racial categories start to overlap with categories of social class. Now, I'm not talking about the official categories here, but we're going to see that part of what it means to be black, part of what it means to be white, part of what it means to be Hispanic or Asian or other is also a reflection of social class. That is something that most people don't think about. Again, this is from the field of study of social anthropology, sociology and anthropology, okay? Now, what I like to point out about this, if race historically is biology, and historically that's how we looked at race as a function of biology. You need to understand that census categories are not a function of biology, and you can see this here. Okay, so where do these come from? Why do we have census classifications? Why do we do the census? Well, it makes sense to count the number of people you have, and this is what we talked about with the census in 2020. Two major reasons that we count people: for representation in government. So the larger a population, California, for example, the more representation they have in the House of Representatives. That's one major reason why we count people. Another major reason we count people is to know how to appropriate federal dollars back to states. States that have more people are states that get more federal dollars for social functioning, transportation, healthcare, schools, law enforcement, on and on and on. Okay. Well, why do we count people according to race? Well, notice that these categories are focused on white. Look at the categories on this page. Look at the category of white going forward. Who created census categories? Black people? Hispanics? White people. Not only in the United States, but also in Europe. And what do we know about people that create the rules? They're the ones that are in power. So this is sort of the background to racial inequality in our world and in our country. If those in power create categories of difference, why do they create categories of difference? In many ways, there's a lot of research and a lot of criticism of census categories that these serve to justify the differences between people. Okay. and the treatment of people. Okay, so as you had a chance to look on through here, free, 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 and a little bit of variation here. Okay, moving on to the next slide, 1850 to 1940. Look at how these names start to change. And look at white. White, 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 white. Now, these names are not just a function of newer peoples that are in North America. For example, here, we start to see a variation on black. Yes, these are actual census categories. In 1890, you were either considered white, black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, and then these Indians as native peoples, and then Chinese and Japanese. Okay. So here's something I like to point out. Notice here from 1890 to 1900 that mulatto disappears. Quadroon, octoroon disappear. So if these racial categories are tied to biology, then did people that are quadroon and octoroon become extinct by 1900 because they're not there anymore? Okay, of course they didn't become extinct. The classification, the definition of what it meant to be black was wrapped into being black in 1900, and then look, 1910, these people reappear. Maybe mulattoes left the United States altogether and went to Europe, and then they all came back by 1910. No, that's not what happens either. These categories change over time. Some do. Whites are not watered down, if you will. Okay? And we look at 1950 to 2010. By the way, the categories of the 2020 census are largely the same as what you see here in 1910. Okay? Look at white. White, 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 white. In 2020, there is the option for white people to better explain their ethnic heritage. White people don't have a culture. They're just white. Okay? You know, do we have German Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans? Yes, we do, but they are not found on the census unless you spell it out under the other category. Okay? And that's only recent. Okay? Some of these categories go away over time as politics change, as our understanding about people change. And again, what we know now is that racial categories are not a very good indicator as to who individuals are. Okay? So why don't we do away with race categories? Okay? The social science explanation of this is that race is not just a question of biology. As a matter of fact, it's more about advantage and disadvantage. It's more about ethnicity as well. And what I mean by that is once we start looking at categories of people according to race, you're going to see differences of education, of income, of poverty, of opportunity. Race is not a biological construct. It's a sociological construct. Okay? So do our perceptions and meaning and ideas and beliefs of people change as individuals change according to social class and education level and income and wealth? You know, we have different perspectives and different stereotypes and prejudices of people. Okay? Interesting stuff. Lastly, this is just another look at the comparison of the classifications of race from 1890 to 1990. Again, the first census is done in 1790, but it's, again, look at how these change over time. A couple of other slides I want to show you. These are the actual definitions. I mean, how do we know in 1890 somebody that is white, black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, Chinese, Japanese, or Indian? Okay, what you're looking at is the actual definitions of the census in 1890. Now, keep in mind, not until 1970 did people self-report. So how do we collect the census data prior to 1970? the federal government hired people to go out to neighborhoods all across the United States and knock on doors and to sit down with people, talk with them, and to fill out the census based upon that interview that they had. Well, if I'm the person, what we call the enumerator, if I'm the person representing the federal government, the Census Bureau, and I come to your house, these are the exact definitions that I have in order to classify you as being white, black, mulatto, quadroon, or octoroon. And this is the definition, okay? I've put in bold something I want you to focus on. It says, the instructions say, be particularly careful to distinguish between blacks, mulattoes, quadroons, and octoroons. The word black should be used to describe those persons who have 3/4 or more black blood. What does that mean? Now, some of you might have younger brothers or sisters. When your brother or sister was born, do they do a blood test to determine whether or not they're white, black, Hispanic, or something else? No. How do you know what race you are? There's no biological test. Now, we're looking at 1890, okay? Did these people representing the Census Bureau show up with a chemistry lab, a biology lab, and take your blood and test it? How do you know what 3/4 black blood is? Better yet, mulatto, those persons who have from 3/8 to 5/8 black blood. So that goes really to knowing your ancestry. How far back do you know your ancestry? You know, keep in mind these gene tests now, the 23andMe and the various ancestry tests that you can do are only been available for the last couple of years in 2020, 2017. This is 1890. So this is largely looking at color of skin, you know, because the genes do come through, pigmentation does come through based on the video you watch from Nina Jablonski. These are crazy. This is the lack of scientific understanding about people in 1890. Why do we categorize people according to being white, black, mulatto, quadroon, etc.? Well, you know why. Because of inequality. We want to classify people and put people in categories so we can keep track of people. Why do we want to keep track of people? Well, there's a whole history of experience of race that we're not going to get a whole lot into in this class, but you can take the class in the fall, Inequality and Society. Now, I mentioned this earlier, looking at race across the United States, the breakout of race and ethnicity. The areas that are green and yellow are the areas that have a higher percentage of people that are non-white. And non-white here means black, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islanders, or Native Americans. Of course, in the South, all across the South, you can see that that's where a large percentage of non-white people live. This is the Mississippi Delta. This is a large concentration of African Americans down through Alabama, across Georgia, and South Carolina. Now, you remember we looked at the breakout of poverty across the United States back in the chapter on social class. And you know that these areas are also high poverty areas. So, is poverty a function of race? Is race a function of poverty? Be careful. It's not a function of biology. It's got a lot to do with history and social experience, opportunity, and those kinds of things. Okay? Now you've seen people that try to equate biology with behavior, and biology with being poor, and biology with being a certain social class background. Okay? We know that the science doesn't bear that out. But does that still play out in our stereotypes, in our prejudices, in our discrimination? Oh, well, that person is a white male, so he must be this way. Oh, that person is a Hispanic female, she is going to be this way. You know, again, that's stereotype perception, and that's not rooted in our understanding of social science and biological science. Okay? Who lives out here? Hispanic folks, who lives out here, Native American folks, okay? And looking at Kentucky, you can see, again, this is also reflected in the data that we looked at. It's largely a white state. Now, when you look at these areas that have high percentages of people that are white, you do see pockets, green right there, which is a high percentage of people that are non-white. What city is that? That's Chicago. What city is this down here? That's Bowling Green. And then Louisville and Lexington, Cleveland, Cincinnati. So those pockets of yellow that you see are areas of more diversity, and those are cities, larger cities, okay? So high concentrations of non-white populations in the South, and then when you look in these more white areas, the diverse areas are usually cities, okay? I believe that's all we're going to look at in this lecture. It is. So there you go. I hope you found that interesting. You know, sometimes the social science doesn't match your perception. Okay, now you see here, you know, we're after the truth. So we're looking at, you know, sociology, anthropology, biology as well to get a really good understanding about human populations. Okay, so I didn't tell you this last lecture. Wash your hands, safe social distancing, be safe, and keep up with your work. Peace.